Now, I want to introduce tonight's lecturer to you, friend of the library, back by popular demand, Stephen Notley, who is going to be lecturing to you about a site. Now, for decades and decades and decades, scholars guessed on where Bethsaida might actually be found. And there was one spot that seemed to command a lot of attention. I won't get into details about why. Q&A afterwards. Fasten your seatbelt and join me in welcoming Stephen Notley.
Well, good evening. It's good to be back here again. This is, again, as Mark mentioned, this is the second time here. So I feel particularly honored. You know, first time you never know what you're going to get. So the fact that they invited me back the second time, especially knowing the fact that the hospitality is just fantastic here. And when an Okie speaks about Texas hospitality, you know it must be impressive. So they've locked the door so you can't leave, finding out that I'm an Okie. But I'm a transplant. I've been gone for quite a while. This evening we're going to speak about an excavation that's been ongoing for the last 3 years. And I've been involved in, but we're going to talk about it in sort of a broader context. I like to look at the question of how do we identify biblical sites. Yesterday, when our panel session, I asked the question, how many people have been to Israel? I'd like to know this evening, how many people have been to Israel? Quite a few. If you're not seeing this on the screen, most of the people in here have been to Israel. And one of the things that you experience is that you go, you get off the bus, you visit the site, the guide, the teacher, professor talks to you about the site. And when you see the sign identifying where you are, no one ever raises the question, how do we know that this is the site? Who knows? What's left here to identify this particular site? And this is an interesting question. I'm a historical geographer, so I should define that. And I'm not actually a formally trained archaeologist. I'm more of a New Testament scholar. I spent 16 years in Israel. And one of the things about studying the New Testament, living in Israel, is that you have to engage the physical realities of the story, sort of the contours of land and how it influences the narrative as we're reading. And so I got involved in historical geography, which is sort of a multidisciplinary approach, looking at history, geography, language, and it does touch on the field of archaeology. And one of the places that interested me is the site we're going to talk about this evening. And when we talk about discovering or finding, has Bethsaida-Julias finally been found? Most people ask the question, I didn't know it was lost. How do you lose a city? How do you lose a city? And again, most people who visit the country don't realize that most of our biblical cities were destroyed, abandoned, forgotten for centuries. It really wasn't until the 19th century, the beginnings of exploration, visits, increased visits to the Holy Land, and people began to sort of, with the Bible in one hand, looking at the land and matching the contours of land, and began slowly identifying the sites. Again, these sites that I've mentioned up here are sites that were lost in time: Megiddo, Ekron, Capernaum, Chorazin. So Old Testament, New Testament sites got lost. And they've only slowly over the last 150 years have been recovered. Sometimes there were guesses about the identification of particular locations that were mistaken. This is before archaeology really began in the Holy Land. And it wasn't until sort of the beginning of the 20th century, into the 19th century, that archaeology began in earnest. And sometimes it would raise questions about previous suggestions of holy sites. And so we're in the context, the larger context of asking the question, how do we identify a particular site that's been lost? And some of the questions that are asked in general are questions that we apply to our site. Already in the middle of the 19th century, there were suggestions about the location of Bethsaida. Bethsaida is mentioned not only in the New Testament, but also the Jewish historian Josephus. He talks a little bit about it as well. So the site was known from the literature, but in terms of identifying the site, there were questions as to its location. The first suggestion was by Edward Robinson from New York City. He came out really as the father of historical geography, coming out in the 19th century, and really began in earnest this question of looking at scripture and land. A very talented, knowledgeable individual, and identified a number of important sites in the country. And he suggested that the site of Bethsaida should be identified with a place that is called in Arabic Et Tel. Et Tel is, we'll talk a little bit about its location. It was one of the alternatives for Bethsaida, and people sort of said, okay, that's a nice idea. There were some ruins laying on the surface. It matches in general the proximity of where we should be looking. And so his idea held for about 30 years. Along came another scholar, a German scholar named Gottlieb Schumacher, and he began to raise questions and challenged Robinson's identification. He suggested another site. He suggested the site of El-Araj. And so I've entitled this sort of the Tale of Two Bethsaidas, because really since that time, there have been vying arguments back and forth between these two sites until today. It brings us to today, and it's been a continuing conversation trying to ask the question, where was Bethsaida? Mentioned in the New Testament, of course, city of the apostles. Peter, Andrew, and Philip came from Bethsaida. Jesus ministers there. Josephus is in Bethsaida. It's mentioned in his writings in antiquities, also mentioned in rabbinic literature. So people were interested in trying to locate this site. But again, these individuals were dealing mainly with surface finds, what was on the surface. Schumacher's complaint about Bethsaida, about Et Tel, was the one of the two things that I would agree with, that these are sort of the two main weaknesses of the site of Et Tel, is its distance from the lake. It's about 3 kilometers from the lakeshore. That's about 1.5 miles from the lakeshore. And the identity of Bethsaida is a fishing village. It's in rabbinic literature. Also, remember that the apostles were fishermen. It has its identity very closely attached to fishing. In fact, its name means the place of fishing. So it has a very close identification with it. And to put quite simply, 3 kilometers is a long way to pull your boat. Okay? It's too far from the shore. Schumacher raised that objection already in the 19th century, and I think it continues to be a festering problem in terms of identifying the site. Again, the identity of Bethsaida is attached to the lake, very closely to the lake. In the Gospels, we read in Mark 6:45, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida. Also, we hear in Josephus' life, for when they heard that some armed men were sailed from Tarikia, that's Magdala, on the other side of the lake, coming to Julias. We're going to talk about that name, Julias. That is the Romanized name for Bethsaida. They were afraid and retired. So we have two accounts where people are arriving by boat. Again, underscoring that idea that Bethsaida was on the lakeshore, very close to the lake. You could get there by boat. The archaeologists at the other site, at Et Tel, who've been excavating there for over 30 years, also sensed that problem. The solution that they put forward is that the lake in the first century was much higher than it is today. The bottom picture is the reality of today. You can see the Bethsaida plain. They suggested that the lake was raised some 5 meters, about 16 feet higher than everyone assumed the first century level was, and it came right up to their site. That's the difficulty with it. It's not just the distance, it's also the height. And in order to overcome that problem, they suggested that the lake was much higher. In their archaeological reports, they suggested that the lake was considerably higher and reached to the place that they're excavating. The problem with that, of course, is that if the lake was that high, it would inundate every known first-century settlement around the lake. If you've been to Capernaum, you've been to Magdala, you've been to Tiberias, all of those would be underwater. So there are problems in that theory in terms of raising the lake to that extent. And I would add to that the report of University of Haifa this last year, looking at the place that we're excavating, and they came to the conclusion at no time was the place that we're excavating currently on the lakeshore in the first century was not underwater. It was never underwater in terms of the Sea of Galilee coming over it. In the first century, it was dry ground. So again, the individuals at University of Haifa have demonstrated that it did not happen. It wasn't raised that high, and so we still have Et Tel 3 kilometers from the lake shore. The second problem, which challenges the other site of Et Tel, are the remains. And I usually just quote Jody Magnus from University of North Carolina, fine archaeologist, in her assessment, and she sort of sums it up well, that the site has fantastic Iron Age remains, Old Testament period remains, but when it comes to the Roman period, that's the New Testament period, there's minimal remains to be found. It's in a decline, and when we get to the Roman period, it almost goes out of existence and compared to its past. In the Hellenistic period and even the Old Testament period, much more significant remains. But when we get to the New Testament period, when it's supposed to reach its zenith in size and prominence, it's at that time that we find almost nothing at that site. Her quote is, "While the Iron Age remains at Bethsaida, at Tel, are monumental and impressive, the Roman period remains are very poor, and therefore the site does not look like an urban center." Now, we'll pick that up and talk a little bit more about what she speaks of an urban center. But again, I'm living in Israel, being around all of this, I kept finding this disconnect between the descriptions of the ancient past. Again, one of the things of a historian or historical geographer is to read the eyewitness accounts, those who walk the streets, those who see the places, and to try to paint a picture, if you will, telling us what was there, the elements that belong to it, and sort of giving us a list of what we should expect to find. And every time I would read the ancient sources and compare those to what I saw at Et Tel, I found a disconnect. I couldn't, it was problematic for me. I wasn't opposed in principle, but it didn't match the evidence. And so in 2007, I published an article, and I decided, why be shy? I published an article that was entitled, "Et Tel is not Bethsaida." In Near Eastern Archaeology, in a peer review, and it sort of started a conversation. There were others. I'm not the first. There were others who had questions about the excavation of the other site, but this was the first time it had really shown up in a peer review journal, which meant it couldn't be ignored, had to be addressed. And so through a series of articles and sort of back and forth forums, the excavator of the site, Rami Arab, who's a friend, and I began to write articles and responding back and forth in terms of a conversation over our two sites, our suggestions. We weren't on the other site yet. The excavations at El-Araj were just being thought of, but nothing had seriously begun. Well, so we began to write back and forth in Near Eastern Archaeology, and Rami sort of concluded it, and I think it's a very fitting conclusion. This is his conclusion in terms of the discussion between the two sites. He says, "The conclusion in the end is simple, and Notley sensed it correctly. Unless one comes up with a better contender for Bethsaida," by that he means Et Tel, "with all of its flaws, Et Tel is still the best Bethsaida we know." In other words, it's the only one that's excavated, therefore by default it is the best candidate. And he said, El-Araj proved not to be Bethsaida simply because it lacks an early Roman occupation stratum. Now, what's behind that statement is his assumption that our site, that there was nothing existed there before the Byzantine period. The Byzantine period is 4th century, that there's nothing earlier, let's say in the Roman period, in the New Testament period, nothing existed there at all. It was only settled from the Byzantine period onwards. And so he said, because there's nothing earlier, there's nothing in the Roman period, there's nothing in the New Testament period, it cannot be a candidate. It's abundantly clear that pottery collected from alluvial areas is a poor representative of the settlement pattern. Probes and excavations are more time-consuming, but are far better tools. So in essence, what it was is it was throwing down the gauntlet, saying, if you think you have another site, excavate it. That's what he's saying. He's saying, look, we're the only site, and until there's another better candidate, we are the site. So we began the process, again, sort of evaluating, looking at the possibilities. I'm going to read here Josephus's account of Bethsaida. It's actually the only time he mentions Bethsaida by that name in all of his writings in antiquities. It's an important text because it will help you understand a little bit more of, in terms of what we should be looking for when we come to our excavation. I think it's a key passage in terms of answering this question. To the village of Bethsaida, located next to the Lake of Gennesaret, that's a local name for the Sea of Galilee. We have, like in Luke 5, the Lake of Gennesaret. Herod Philip granted the dignity of a city by introducing a multitude of inhabitants and other fortifications, and he called it Julias, after the name of the daughter of the emperor. What's important about Josephus's witness is the transformation that takes place on the site of Bethsaida. And it underscores, again, the problem of the other site is that Philip urbanizes. That'd be the way we would use it. He urbanizes this village. He takes this small little village and creates a polis, a city. So if we're excavating, we should be looking for and expect to find elements of sort of Greco-Roman culture, taking of a small Jewish village and expanding it, contributing it to it. He gives two things. He says that he increased the population, increased the size of the population, and he added to it fortifications. So we should expect to be finding those things, but in general, we should be looking for an urban development of the site. So that's the witness that we have from Josephus. Then we have, as we move forward, we have another witness that talks about, so we're painting a picture of what we should expect to find. We find references to Bethsaida in the Roman period, two Roman authors, Pliny and Claudius Ptolemy. An important one is Eusebius in the 4th century. When he gets to talking about Bethsaida, it's very interesting. He gives us, this is his entry, he gave us a list of all the biblical cities in the land of Israel, biblical sites, gives descriptions to them, if there's remains there, or there's certain populations, maybe Samaritans, Christians, Jews living there. He tells us about it. When he doesn't know anything about the site, or there's nothing there, or he doesn't know where it is, all he does is quote Bible. He quotes scripture. He doesn't give us any personal details. And that's exactly what he does with Bethsaida. He says, Bethsaida, a city of Andrew, Philip, Peter, and Philip, which comes from John 1:44, and it is located in the Galilee next to the Lake of Gennesaret, which he picks up from Josephus. So he really tells us nothing more. So what does that indicate to us? That indicates to us that in the time of Eusebius in 305, Bethsaida's gone. We have references to it in the New Testament period. We have references, another reference in the 1st century, another in the 2nd century. By the time we get to the end of the 3rd century and the beginning of the 4th century, it disappears. It's a very interesting thing, and remember that as we come back and start looking at the correspondence between excavation and historical witness. This is the way that we sort of find whether our site matches what people are telling us that we should discover. Another thing you should take into account is the rabbis also talk about Bethsaida, the 2nd century, the 3rd century, but then they go silent also. Everybody stops talking about Bethsaida. It disappears. It doesn't come back until about 200 years later, we began having pilgrimages coming out. We hear about a man named Theodosius. He mentions it in his coming of his pilgrimage to the Holy Land, going around the Sea of Galilee. A couple hundred years later, we have another pilgrim who comes to the Holy Land, a bishop from Bavaria named Willibald, and he gives us a very interesting testimony about Bethsaida. This is his pilgrimage around the Sea of Galilee. From Tiberias, they went around the sea by the village of Magdala to the village of Capernaum, where our Lord raised the prince's daughter. And from Capernaum, they went to Bethsaida. So in his day, Bethsaida exists. You'll understand in a minute why this is important, these testimonies. From which came Peter and Andrew. There is now a church. So we should expect to find a church here. There should be a church on the site. Where previously there was a house, they remained there one night, and the next day went over to Chorazin. This is probably a mistake in the writing. He probably means Corsia, where our Lord raised the demoniacs. Again, that's on the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee, and sent the devil into a herd of swine. Here was the church of Christians. Finally, into the 19th century, we began to have these explorers coming out, people visiting, and Sir Lawrence Oliphant mentions when he visits El-Araj, here are situated the ruins of El-Araj, which consists of foundations of old walls and blocks of basalt stone, cut and uncut, which have been used for building purposes. The ruins cover a limited area. So that's the testimony that we have. Now the question is, when we started digging at El-Araj, is what were we going to find? Again, Rami told us we won't find anything before the Byzantine period, that it's not occupied until a much later period of time, and therefore can't be New Testament Bethsaida. So in 2014, we began, first thing we did was a shovel survey. For those who are not familiar with that, that's where you take a 5 by 5 meter square, you dig down shovel's depth, and you sift and bring out the pottery, coins, glass, things that are datable, and a good archaeologist can take those elements. By the way, I should mention I'm working with Moti Aviam at Connecticut College. He's the director of the dig. I'm the academic director. I oversee the field school that goes on in connection with the dig, but he is actually the director of the excavation. And Moti was with us, and a good archaeologist can take those bits of evidence, and we dug about a dozen squares and pulled out the elements, and then they can draw a profile. They can sort of tell you who lived here at particular times, a general profile of the site. On the basis of that, we decided it was worthwhile for us to excavate. So we determined to set up and to do 3 years of excavation. Initially, that was our idea. And so we began to excavate at the site. It's an interesting site. Israelis call it Beit HaBek, the house of the pasha, the governor. It was a Druze aristocrat from Damascus. He lived there. You can see the house there in the distance. We don't have very many good pictures of it, but it sits on the site of El-Araj. Again, in Hebrew, the Israelis all know it by the name of Beit HaBek. In Arabic, it's El-Araj. And he had a villa there on the site. The reason I have it up here is that this is another very interesting little piece of information. You never know where you're going to get information on a site. It comes from the most unusual locations at times. Off to the left, I have a picture of an old book. I actually scanned that before I came here. The cover of it, this is a book that I found. I was aware of this. This was a pastor who was there in the 20s, and he decided to make a visit, to come by boat over to visit the individual at Beit HaBek. He was not there at the time, but when he arrived, there were Arab workmen who were digging alongside of the house, and he said they had dug down about 2 meters, and he said they came across a magnificent mosaic. He called it a Roman mosaic. I assume that being a pastor, he probably could not tell if it was Roman or Byzantine. But he talked about a beautiful multicolored mosaic that it was beside the house, that extended under the house. and the Arab workmen did not know what to do with it, so they covered it back up. It was this gentleman's suggestion that this was perhaps the mosaics belonging to the church that was seen by Willibald, the church that was over the house of Peter and Andrew, that had, of course, disappeared in time, and that they stumbled upon it and then covered it back up. That will you'll understand why that's important in terms of where we decided to excavate on our site. But again, this is 1929. It's evidence of something that is there, so it raises our expectations. We should expect to find a mosaic under the ground somewhere near to the house. The problem is that the house was blown up in 1955. And the political developments in the Middle East, where we are, found itself within Syria, although we're within the armistice 100 meters from the shore. But in any event, this was occupied by the Syrian forces from 1948 onwards. And this area was used, one of the areas that was used to shoot at Israeli fishermen on the lake. And so in an expedition, the Israeli soldiers came in and blew up the house in 1955. So since 1955, it was pretty much a pile of rubble. Those of us who dug the first couple of seasons at El-Araj remember the huge mound of concrete and stone that was there, that was the remnants of this house. But again, you can see from the picture that it's right on the lakeshore, and this is today. This gives you a sense of the layout of today. One of the confusing things, or not confusing, but it's a different thing just to take into account, and I've drawn on here the red line showing you where the coastline was earlier, even in the modern past, in times since I've been there, since I've lived there, but especially in the first century, this would have been right on the coastline. El-Araj is right there in the center. Everything that you see above it going out is a delta that has developed since 1969. There were winter storms in 1969 that caused damage to the Jordan River, and the Jordan River has been snaking its way out ever since. And it's created a delta, so the shoreline as we see it laid out now is not the shoreline that existed in the first century. But I mentioned the thing of the Beck's house because where you can see it noted on there, it'll help you understand why we started to excavate where we excavated. Notley wanted to excavate up next to the house, hoping that we can find the mosaic, and so that at least we can talk about having a tradition, a memory of this being the location of Bethsaida, at least in the Byzantine period as we make our way back. So we began excavating there, and this has been really the site of our excavation. I sat the other evening talking with other archaeologists about their digs, and some of the digs are quite large. I heard 150 people for 6 weeks, and the first 2 seasons were quite small. We're a very small expedition. First 2 seasons were 20 people for 2 weeks. If you know anything of archaeology, it takes 1 day to set up and 1 day to break down. So sum total, you have 8 days of digging. So it's actually quite remarkable that it's garnered the publicity and the attention that it has with such modest efforts. We've been limited to some extent. We've increased our size. Last summer, we were 4 weeks, 40 people for 4 weeks, so we sort of quadrupled our efforts and began to sort of expand out and deepen our investigation of Bethsaida. For those who have not been on a dig, and I know for the archaeologists you'll sort of yawn at all of this, but it's always interesting for those who have not been on a dig to know a little bit about what goes on. So I've included a couple of slides in here. In terms of our dig, the first thing is that we get up at the crack of dawn. Actually, we get up before dawn. You're usually up at 4:30, and many of the sites, I know it's the same, that they get up quite early in the morning because it's hot, and you do most of your digging from until noon. Especially if you're digging in the summertime because of the oppressive heat. We excavate, we're taking out things in buckets, we're sifting. We actually do dry sifting here. I've been introduced to the There are some digs that are going on that are wet sifting. That's a much more developed process than we have. But we do dry sifting, and where they're putting on a screen, and we're pulling out remnants that are datable. That's the thing that we're looking for coins, looking for pottery that have rims on it, things that which the archaeologists can establish some sense of dating in the levels. Again, we do that, we collect them, and then we usually what we do is we gather them, soak them, then we wash ours. Our process is we sit down every afternoon after a rest, after siesta, we wash our pottery, and then we allow it to dry, and the next day the archaeologists read the pottery. They go through, they look for inscriptions, they look for datable elements. It's also a very educational time for our students to be able to see how this goes, how you go about doing this, what kind of information can you glean from the archaeological remains. So we began this process, the excavation in 2016, and we go in sort of reverse order. If you want to think of it as we go back in time, as we're excavating, we go down. And our site, the first thing we encountered were Crusaders. Not necessarily surprising, although it was an interesting thing to find. We actually found a Crusader sugar factory. It's not unknown. This phenomenon is known in this part of especially in the Jordan Valley. So we found sugar vessels. Apparently, the Crusaders they're not so much in terms of building. They usually are using other people's structures, the remains from the Byzantine period particularly, but they had sort of modest, I would say rough elements there in terms of their construction, their buildings, but seems like they had a simple process in terms of developing sugar, and it looks like an earthquake or something destroyed everything is sort of catastrophic. And we found turned over stacks of bowls for the processing of the sugar. One of the fun things that we had, interesting things we had, is we usually see it in pieces, and we send it off. And unbeknownst to us, there was an archaeologist, a person who'd been trained in archaeology, but she worked in a senior home, and these seniors needed things to do, and so she actually trained them over the period of 2 years she would take things, break them, have them, they didn't practice on ours, but she gave them things to learn the process, and they put these back together, and then last summer, our vessels came back to us, and these senior citizens came back, and they were brimming with pride at what they had done, they had accomplished. It was really a wonderful experience of bringing these vessels back to the site to show the archaeological team, what had been reconstructed. So it's really a nice process, but you can see here how these vessels function in terms of the sorghum and making the sugar being made by the Crusaders. As we dig down, we continue on down. As I said, the Crusaders use the Byzantine structures that are there before them. Of significance is a long 30-meter Byzantine wall, very well-made wall, at some points even header and stretcher construction, very serious wall, well-intentioned. Moti has worked a lot with churches in the Galilee and has excavated a number of them. There actually are a number of churches spread all over the countryside in the Galilee, and oftentimes they were monasteries around churches. They were hospitality. They gave hospitality to pilgrims, and he thinks that what we have here is the remnant also of a monastery that surrounded a church in the Byzantine period. And each season we're uncovering more and more of those remains of the Byzantine presence here. These are some of the elements that were vessels. Again, we have lots of tessera. There we go. Of tessera. Thank you. We found hundreds and hundreds of unused tessera. We're not sure exactly. Those are the little cubes that are being made for the mosaics. These are unused. They're not destroyed. We just found piles and piles and piles of them. So apparently they were in the process of of construction. Probably the most important thing from the Byzantine period, the most important thing, is what appears in the hand. Those are glass. They're gold-gilded glass tessera. They're made out of their glass, and they're gilded in gold. That's not something that appears on the floor. That's something that only appears on the walls of churches. So we're having evidence of this church that we read about from Willibald, who talks about coming there and seeing a church over the house of Peter and Andrew. And we're, again, finding evidence of that. Every season we find more and more of this glass tessera gilded in gold, which is pointing us to what lies underneath. One of the interesting things for me, you remember when we were looking at the literary sources, you have a gap where it went silent, right? We were reading and suddenly Eusebius, it goes silent. The rabbis go silent for about 200 years. One of the fascinating things that happened was that as we were excavating, we came to as you were excavating down, we came to a point at the floor of the Byzantine period. Suddenly we had a layer about 40 centimeters thick, 40 centimeters of like silt. It's almost like sand. It would go right through your screen with nothing in it. We had archaeological remains above it, but in there was nothing, no coins, nothing at all. And as we went down through that sort of 40 centimeters of silt, suddenly we found ourselves in the Roman period. Again, when the geologists came from the University of Haifa and they tested this, this was not from the Sea of Galilee rising up and over us. They're able to tell the nature of the flooding. This is from the Jordan. It seems that what happened in the earlier settlement was flooded, massive floods from the Jordan, destroyed Bethsaida for about 150 years, and then it's resettled in the Byzantine period. We find the evidence of this all over, of this sort of layer in there that matches the silence. This is for me, is one of the fascinating things, is to find the correspondence between the historical witnesses and what we find in terms of our archaeological remains, or in this instance, where there's no archaeological remains. There's a gap in our information. Again, just to sort of recap, we have above it, we have Byzantine structures. Then as we came down, we have this gap of silt, about 40 centimeters. And then suddenly we find ourselves in completely Roman construction, pottery, coinage, and so indicating that we're in an earlier period. Again, as we go back in time, as we go down, we're going back in history. We're moving closer and closer to the 1st century. As we moved into the Roman period, we find cooking pots. We also, which are typical of Galilean period cooking pots there. Most significantly, and this is really what garnered the headlines, is that as we dug down and we once again started hitting Roman remains, we came upon a mosaic floor. A mosaic floor that was bichrome, white and black. And at first we thought perhaps it was a synagogue because it looked like the pattern that you find at Magdala and the synagogue there. So we got all excited thinking we'd found a synagogue. It ended up, it was not a synagogue, but it still had important significance. Before I take the slide over to there, though, I want to point out something. This is one of the things that doesn't always reach the news, but is of major significance about what we've uncovered. And that is the individual there is measuring the height, or I should say the depth of that floor. That measuring stick is right on the mosaic floor, and it is at 211 meters below sea level. That has stumped archaeologists all around the lake. Anyone who's digging around the lake has been stumped by this, because the generally assumed level of the lake was 209 meters below sea level. We write it in a negative. I know this is counterintuitive for most people, but as the number gets increases, it goes down. So the higher one is the lower number. So you can see that as you go down, the numbers get more. In essence, we are finding structures on the lakeshore that are at least 2 meters below what was supposed to be the level of the lake, which shouldn't be. It's funny because we were digging, when we started coming out with all these questions, and people were challenging us, geologists started coming. Not archaeologists, geologists came, and they said, thank God. Someone's finally decided to dig on the lake. We've been telling you for years that the lake was much lower than you all assumed. So what we're finding here is that this is challenging a number of perspectives around the lake in terms of the archaeology that's going on. But we would suggest that the lake in the first century is much lower than everyone assumed. Certainly much lower than the folks at Etel would want us to believe. But even beyond that was much lower than everyone was assuming. Again, we found a mosaic there. On the floor, it had been broken, and so it had undergone some destruction and stuff, but we found it in situ, in its location. It was found together with also roof tiles and something that we call tubuli, which are the vents. When you bring all of these together, these are parts of a Roman bath. Why is that important? This is the first evidence of urbanization. Urbanized. Remember when we read about Josephus? He says that Herod Philip took this little village and transformed it into a city. It was no longer this small little Jewish village anymore. He urbanized it. This is the first evidence of urbanization in this area. And again, when that happened, the newspapers caught wind of it that finally, at last, again, in 30 years of excavations of the other site, no evidence of urbanization that we're finding here at this site. Indications that what we're seeing here is evidence of that transformation that took place during the period of Herod Philip. These are two probes. That was the one probe on the one side, another probe on the eastern side. We continued to go on down. There wasn't a mosaic floor there, so they could continue going on down even farther. And in that, they came across a coin, Nero, 66. So where coins are always very good, archaeologists are always loving coins because they help with dating. So this gives us a date in terms of the layers that we're digging with. We're into the first century. Again, below the floor of the Roman bath. This is in the probe right next to it. As I mentioned, when that happened, there was a lot of publicity that came out. Everything from USA Today to National Geographic, talking about the find there. It really is a very, very small, comparatively, very small excavation, but the significance of what was found, the evidence pointing to the existence of the first century village, Bethsaida, caught the imaginations of people around the world. We've continued to dig. Last year we expanded our excavation, continued to go down. As I mentioned to you, we increased the size, the number of people who are there. Probably some of the more important things we found in the upper right-hand here on the screen is what's called a knife-paired lamp. It is, some of you may know it as a Herodian lamp. If you were wandering around the old city, someone trying to sell you a Herodian lamp, a knife-paired lamp is a particular style. What's important about this is it's only made in area of Jerusalem in the Second Temple period. So it means that somebody from this place, and I would say from Bethsaida, Bethsaida-Julias, has traveled to Jerusalem and brought a memento back with them. It's evidence, again, of a first century setting, a Jewish setting, of a connection to Jerusalem that existed there. In the lower right-hand panel, you'll see this is the remnants of fresco. So we have sort of two cultures here. We have a Jewish culture being represented in the knife-paired lamp, the spout from the lamp up there on the screen. And then down below, we have evidence of frescoes. We found houses with frescoes in them, numbers of lamps Roman period lamps in them, and this is in a small area called Area B, which is nearby. We also found a base for a chancel screen. Again, each year we're finding more and more elements that belong to this Byzantine church. Still looking for the mosaic. This next season, the thing that we hope to do is to take our entire area, everything that is presently Byzantine, and go all the way down into the Roman level and expand our knowledge of the existence, the settlement of this place during the Roman period. One of the fascinating things that came out of the dig is what we call the Lioness of El-Araj. It's an interesting story. Remember I told you about the rubble and the piles that were there. One of the tour groups that showed up, that come through sometimes, we're in a little sort of a remote area, and tour groups find their way there, and one tour group decided to start digging around and pilfering the site, which I'll tell you is illegal. You're not allowed to do that. And they pulled out of the rubble, they pulled this lioness. Fortunately, she is 600 kilograms, which is about 1,300 pounds. So she did not fit neatly into a suitcase. So they left her there. The next week, a friend of mine had a tour group came showing up, and there it was. And so they quickly gathered it up and took it back to Canary College. So what's important about that, I've said several times, I've emphasized about the Byzantine church that existed on the site. Typically, we're not in Galilee. We're actually technically in the Golan. We're in the lower Golan region. As you cross the Jordan, you enter into the region of the Golan. And in the Golan region, you have, in villages, they will have either a church or a synagogue. It'll either be a Jewish village or a Christian village. One of the interesting things is that the exception to that are settlements on the lake. If you've been to Capernaum, you know you have a synagogue and a church there. If you've driven around to Kursi, the place of the demoniacs, where Christ cast the demoniacs, you have a church and you have a synagogue there. And so it seems that on the lake there's an exception. Israeli scholars say that in the Golan, when one finds a lion like this, in 95% of the cases you have evidence of a synagogue. If we have a Byzantine church, which all the literature seems to point to, and the physical evidence seems to point to, and we have indications of a synagogue, and again, we have some architectural elements that are reminiscent of a synagogue. We have the heart-shaped columns that you encounter oftentimes in first-century synagogues. We have those there as well. We may have another one of those exceptions on the lake, a place that is important not only for Christians but also Jews. So we continue our excavation. This is our team from the second session, and we're zooming on up. And we're again, we continue next season. We're going to continue our work. We dig from the middle of June to the middle of July. Every year, we're expecting to be there 4 more years. So if anybody, I've had a couple of people come up and ask me about the possibilities of coming and joining us on the dig. We'd be welcome to have you come and participate, to be involved in it. Again, we move along. We're a humble dig. We're modest dig in terms of our size, but we think we're important. I like to tell folks that I try not to be too Hollywood-esque, but we are looking for the last lost city of the Gospels. I think it's an important site both in Jewish history and Christian history. It's an intersection of both of our histories there. I think it's terribly important. For me as a Christian, person who's lived there and studied there, understanding something of the setting, the stage on which our Lord ministered, taught, I think is a very important thing for me. And so I view it as an incredible opportunity to be involved in this expedition and looking to further our discovery in the coming summer. So again, Mark, I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about the excavation, and I'm open to any questions you folks might have.
Thank you so much. Join me in thanking him. I'll start out with a question of what are the ages of people who can go on such a dig?
We have, I think the youngest we've had, I think was Catherine's been among the youngest. No, we've had some younger. We've had some in their late teens. Actually, we had. Well, I'm not going to get to Johann. He was 2, but we've had a number of people in their past. I haven't asked them exactly their age, but they're past 70. Let's just say that. So it's really not always about age. It's about fitness. And
so people who are in their 70s can go and get academic credit.
Yes.
And work toward that next degree.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. And then you did a good job of explaining that you can't just be looking for signs that say Bethsaida city limits.
Right. No.
Unless the population. So it's actually a process.
There's a process, a long, patient process, right?
Yeah. All right. One of the questions we've got, and again, if you want to text in a question, text it to Brent. You don't even have to say his name. Just know his number. We've already got one that Brent's forwarded to me, but his number is 832-722-5749. And again, he does pizza delivery. He does everything. So don't hesitate to keep that number on speed dial. Our first question comes from Lipscomb. I'll do this one first. Peter seems to be living in Capernaum by the time of Jesus' ministry, according to Mark and the Catholic Church. Do you agree? And then he adds, Capernaum then becomes a city worshiping Jesus as Messiah, perhaps, for centuries. Do you expect to discover Bethsaida was a city following Christ? What would you be looking for to show a synagogue where Jesus was worshipped or actually worshipped? So run with it.
We do have both traditions. We have Peter certainly in Capernaum in terms of the ministry of Jesus. We also have John's testimony that Peter, Philip, Andrew came from Bethsaida, John 1:44. So it could be that they were born there, they grew up there, they may have moved over to Capernaum. Capernaum was would have been a much larger town in their day. So they could have moved over there. I don't know exactly when or how, but he could have moved over. In terms of what we're looking for at Bethsaida, El-Araj, I would expect to find a synagogue. The finding of a synagogue, of course, is always difficult. One is identifying what are the telltale signs of a synagogue. But I would expect to find a place of worship, synagogue. Usually the primary thing we find are benches in it for gathering. And I would expect to find some place there where they gathered, worshipped. Where or how we locate that, it's a large area. So
okay, one of the other debates that exists, and in my mind it's not a debate because I have a very strong opinion on this, but I won't say it in case you disagree with me until after you say yours.
Am I allowed to say no comment?
No.
Okay.
But one of the issues that some people still debate, which I don't see as debatable, is how many languages Jesus may have spoken. And it's clear he spoke Aramaic. I think it's clear he spoke Hebrew. But I think it's clear he spoke Greek.
Yes.
And the fact that, and I get that from a number of different sources, but the fact that we have this city where he clearly would have ministered, that it's built up by the Romans, with Greek being the language of commerce, even of the Romans, does anything that indicates Greek language, Greek intercourse, Greek commerce, or anything like that here?
I would expect as it grows. Again, you said something about Roman expansion. Herod Philip was Jewish, so that's probably Hellenized because his region has a population of both Jews and non-Jews in it. To answer your first question, of course, you know what because the last time I was here I was talking about Hebrewisms in the New Testament, but I think that Jesus certainly knew Hebrew, knew Aramaic, and I would think also he knew Greek. There's certain indications that he knew Greek because he seems to hint at Aesop's fables These fables were oftentimes used to train young boys, children, how to learn very inductively. So I would expect he would know all of those, and I would expect to find evidence of all of those in our city.
By the way, my new argument for Jesus knowing Greek is his brother James,
Yes.
who wrote James.
Yes.
James is some of the best reading Greek in the New Testament. His brother is pretty good with it. I mean, it's not like choppy Greek. It's really good. It's brief. Okay. Is the first century shoreline you showed proposed or established? In either case, what effect would this have had on the shoreline sites around the Sea of Galilee during the first century?
According to the geologists, it's established. The geologists they speak definitively of that being the shoreline of the first century. They've already done soundings there. They've evaluated our soil and our excavation. And for them, there's no question about that. And that would not affect the shoreline of anyone else around the lake. It wouldn't. Again, as I explained, what we see there, that delta is only from 1969. According to the geologists, people are there. They said this is a modern phenomenon.
Dale Manor, where's Dale? Dale has been digging in Beth Shemesh for how long?
18 years.
18 years. Are digs expensive?
Yes.
That was yes.
Anybody wants to contribute? Here we are.
And come up here, Dale, for a moment, please. Y'all welcome Dale, a man of the heart. I want you to help me and help Steve and maybe indirectly help yourself. Let everybody hear in the microphone, are digs expensive?
Yeah, very expensive.
And so,
This speaker right here. So, this one, it's all of the speakers. But doesn't stop me. Hey, I don't even need this thing. So here's my question. You've got to raise money for these digs. Say it loud. Yes. Don't be bashful. You've got to raise money for digs. Yes. If people need to know how I assume it doesn't even, you would take small currency. You take anything that out. Okay. Say it loud. Yes. Okay. If y'all want to contribute and help these gentlemen in what they do, it is something Becky and I believe in. It's something we like to take part in. It is something you would like to take part in. And the next time you go to the Holy Land, you tell everyone you want to go to El-Araj, which is the real city of Bethsaida, and you want to find your own little lion that you can take on. Steve Notley told you to.
Can I just add?
Please.
I mean, I don't want to compete here. I will just say, because he opened the subject, that any gifts are tax deductible.
Is that true also for you?
Definitely.
Okay, go sit down. What does El-Araj mean?
It means, it's actually a fast, no one's ever, give me 2 minutes?
Yeah?
It means, Kirvat El-Araj means the ruins of the lame man. I actually had an idea, I'll probably publish, so we'll see, someone else will take this and publish it now. I think in the Byzantine period there gets to be a confusion. I'm answering the question, why do we call it that? There was a confusion, most of you read John 5, the healing of the man at, so you fell into it, Bethesda. The pool of Bethesda.
It's a trick.
But already, I had to pay her to do that.
You did good.
But already in the Byzantine period, those place names get confused, and
And Jerome, who is translating Eusebius' Onomasticon, when he comes to Bethesda, he calls it Bethsaida. And if you read your ESV Bible, you'll see footnoted below Bethesda, you'll see or Bethsaida, because we have a number of manuscripts that read that. I think what happens is we move into the Byzantine period, confusion over that place name of Bethesda gets confused with Bethsaida. If you'll read John 5, you have the healing in the beginning, and then you have Jesus doing a bunch of teaching but no traveling. Chapter 6 begins, and Jesus is on the Sea of Galilee, with no mention of a travel. And so if you're a Byzantine who doesn't know the land or anything, you start confusing those, and I think our site gets confused with the healing of the man at Bethesda. And so it became known as the place of the healing of the lame man.
Okay,
I'm sorry, that was a complicated
that
answer.
was a great answer. No, that was a great answer, and for some reason I'm speaking into this. But it's kind of a little cherry flavor, so I'm why don't you excavate in spring or fall? This is someone that is weather sensitive.
My answer is I have a day job. No, but there are some excavations that go on at different times of the year. Generally, most of the excavation is what goes on in the summertime because you don't want it to rain. And we have a dry season, and we go from April till October without any rain. And so they want dry weather. So generally, most of the excavations take place in the summertime. And of course, that's when students are also off in the summer and things of that nature. But generally, it's because of the weather.
Do you know a historical geographer named Dr. Jim Fleming?
Sure, I know.
Brent Johnson, man of the hour. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I know Jim.
That's all they asked.
Okay. Jerusalem's a small town. We all know each other.
Et tel, is it possible that the distance from the lake could be delta built up?
No.
Explain why, please.
I just go by the geologists. It's at no time where we're excavating, at least in the first century, was not under the lake. It was dry ground. Again, the excavations at the other site assumed two things. First of all, that we were underwater, and two, that nothing existed where we are until the Byzantine period. Those are the two working assumptions of Et tel. And both of those have been shattered. There's just no question about it. In the Roman period, we are on dry ground. In the New Testament period, we're in dry ground. And we have Roman remains. And he has a wonderful site. I should speak and just say, I respect Mommy's work. He has a wonderful site. I consistently take my groups up there all the time. It has a wonderful Iron Age site. It also has a wonderful perspective over the Bethsaida plains. And I take my students up there, sit them down, and we have a discussion about site identification. And we talk about the whole issues there. There's no personal animus about their site. It's a wonderful site. It doesn't match. And I hope I've done a good enough job this evening that you have people who are describing the place, and you develop a picture, and his site just doesn't look like Bethsaida. So, but there's, according to the geologists, and again that's a completely different discipline. The area that we are, the plain that we are, is dry ground. We have a battle. Josephus describes a battle between the Jewish forces and the Romans on that plain. In the first century. So there's no delta, it can't be any delta built up. It's not like Ephesus. If you've been to Ephesus, people always want to bring Ephesus, talking about the moving of the coast out. This is a completely different situation. It doesn't work, it doesn't solve this dilemma.
Don't have the Meander River here.
No.
All right. One last question. How does the German Bavarian Willibald from the Middle Ages know that the house was Peter's if the city had been destroyed for 200 years?
Good question. Byzantine tradition, sometimes, if you know anything of Byzantine tradition, sometimes they hold on to, they retain memories, ancient memories. So you shouldn't always dismiss them, but sometimes those traditions are driven by necessity. Suddenly Christianity became popular, people were coming out, and they want to know, where did these things happen? And so out of that, sometimes the churches there's not a lot of evidence for those. So the person's right in asking the question. If we have a Byzantine tradition, and that's what he's testifying to. He's testifying to a tradition in his time that this is the place of Peter, the home of Peter and Andrew, built over their house. And the question is, how reliable is that? That's a valid question. What I tried to show in here is that there's a continuity of identification with Bethsaida from the Roman period right on up, with this gap in historical witness that corresponds to that 40 centimeters of silt. Some catastrophic event happened there from the Jordan, but there's a continual memory. We in the West sometimes dismiss memories. I'll give this one last example. We dismiss memories and say, oh, they just made that up. And I remind people that in the old city of Jerusalem, you call the Damascus gate Bab al-Amud, the gate of the column, and that name remembers a column that has not been standing there for 1,500 years. So it's a reminder to us to be careful not to dismiss memories, and because people are still living there. There's a continual population that...
There's still a street called Straight in Damascus.
So so I'm not saying that would not be scientific evidence, sort of conclusive proof, but it's something you shouldn't ignore. You sort of bring the bits of evidence. You deal with law. You deal with bits of evidence and you collect them together, and you try to see if there's a pattern to that evidence that's pointing us to a conclusion, and that's what we're doing. And I would say that all of us on the team, this is the last thing I'll say about our thing, is that we generally we're reticent to say we have Bethsaida. What we say is that we think we have the best candidate, and we're digging and seeing where the evidence leads us. And that's what we want to find. I want to know, is this it? If this is not it, then it's going to be I don't think it's at Etel. I think we've already, after 30 years, we know enough about that site, but if it's not our site, perhaps it's another. I think thus far, the things that we're finding have us as the leading candidate for Bethsaida. That's the language we try to use.